Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John Morgan, and this is a continuation, part 5 of our discussion of the extreme histogram. And when we were last talking, I mentioned that within the certain ranges, in this particular case, the red line is -60 and the cyan line is 50. When we look at price behavior within those ranges, and I mentioned before that it tends to be a very bullish setup, the natural question then is, well, how bullish is that? Well, what we can do is, by placing those numbers inside of the computer and just testing between those two ranges, the probability for the next bar closing higher, in this particular case, is 57%. So whenever we get a reading that fits between this range, we know that we have a 57% probability of a higher close the very next day. That's pretty powerful when looking at your overall projection if you want to hold a position, get out of a position. And the way it's programmed in here, we can also just right click in TradeStation, and in particular, if we go from the 60 to 62 range, which is just happens to be where price at the end of this chart is, you have a 65% probability of a close higher from this particular day going into the next day. That is a strong statistic, and it shows the interesting nature of moves below the red line, because we know that below 60 is a good likelihood that you're going to have a retest of that low. But it often becomes an extreme sell-off setup that forces a buyback and then collapses later on. And it's that second collapse that we look to as our opportunity to have caught the knife that has bounced up off the floor and landed on that pillow that lets us know that we have a higher histogram on a lower low and a clear buy signal. And when you add in those kind of percentages, very attractive. In this case, it becomes even easier because at the open, your next day histogram is much higher. If this histogram were not already higher to start the day, I would have a less stronger opinion about the higher finish. And in this particular case, the histogram started considerably higher above the 50 line and proceeded higher the rest of the day. And now you can see the slope of that angle right here. It gives you an idea of the speed and the expectation. So we would expect the next level of histogram to continue to move higher. It's when we get inside of that -12 area that we begin to become more cautious, and that's typically when you start to see a slowing. And it's not necessarily indicative of the number of days. I know in candlestick charting people will talk about 3 to 5 day runs. While some of those are true, you can't gauge them off the same probability that you can when looking at these kind of statistical numbers. Now, the length on this chart happens to be 16 years, and that's just because it ranges from decimal points. And so where on the MBIs we can go back 20 plus years, when it comes to this kind of math, needed to have it be done in decimals because fractions just are not convertible to the algorithm. But that gives you an idea of some of the probabilities that can be derived using the histogram by itself. And when we start to add in some of our other indicators, or for instance, if I move on, we can go into a weekly chart, and you can begin to see the same setups within a weekly chart. And when we're able to get all of our ducks in a row, like in this particular case, at the end of the chart, you have your weekly histograms dramatically higher, and yet you've made lower price. You have this effective cross setup that you see here, and the same setup is being developed right here. It becomes a very bullish trend move, and an opportunity to actually capture some pretty decent moves in the market. And when you also see, I've marked where there are positive histograms and those retrace lines, and then also existing points where we exceeded past on a double move on positive histogram and retraces. So from a weekly standpoint, you get a broader scope of what you're then looking at from your daily chart. And it just provides an added bonus into really analyzing where price is about to go and how best you can trade it without as much concern that other people might have. Looking at this decline, they may have thought that this was going to continue lower, but our histogram suggested otherwise, since we were making higher histograms overall, even during the decline. So hopefully that helps. As always, trade well and continue to look for additional YouTube videos on the remainder of the indicators that are still available for view.